Someone did some heavy folding to get these to stay up.
I'm afraid they don't have quorum yet.
Scott is upstairs wrapping up a meeting with Brian White.
Boyd should be here. Not heard otherwise. Boyd is? Oh, I was like, too soon, Ted, too soon.
I'm texting him upstairs.
The transitionary period. It's gonna be live streamed yet today, Keith?
Yes. Yep, Rick should be back.
Well, every time you think of a meeting now, you have to be like, is it in person or is it?
You know, I keep
That
like.
never existed before in my life, but now I'm just thinking about it. That's a lot. That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot for me too.
I couldn't remember if Tim was
No.
gone. We knew
Right.
Tim and PJ were gone, right?
Yeah, so the max possible will be 6.
And I'm in the, like, oh, I don't know if they're gonna be cool with masks or not.
Yeah, so I like grab a max, so like,
There's one in here.
I have like 6 in my backpack right now because every time I grab one, I'm thinking, I probably don't have one in my backpack. And then I walk in and I like put it in, and I'm like, oh, there's like 4 of them in there. Just keep adding up.
How's Mr. MB?
Doing good.
Looking tan. He is.
Yeah. It was
Miss Beanie's on the.
Saturday was my wife was hanging out with her sister all day, and there was a little golf in the morning, and then there was catching up with the pool in the afternoon. And with Scoon and our 2 boys, Winding Creek Saturday morning. And I played a little Mac Legends one other time.
Trees covering where I'm at.
You're like me.
Yeah.
You don't have to wear sunscreen. The last person that asked me if I play golf, I said, do you mind if I just throw the ball? Exactly.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Nope, you're good with 5 out of 8, so.
Yep. But you believe Scott is on his way down?
He knew he was running late, so don't wait for him.
Okay.
I say that about one of my bosses. I should be careful.
We never have.
It's only one, Keith. You got 9. You're fine. Or however many there are.
No. Depending on who you ask.
There you go.
9, 35,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can only imagine what he says about me.
Hey, nice thing.
You'll have to show up late and we'll let you know.
I'm just saying.
Okay. Well then, we'll get rolling. Everyone, welcome. I hope everyone it's been a month since we met, so hope everyone, we don't look any different.
We have mouths.
Keith is tan. Yeah, beautiful smiles. Great, well, we'll just dive right in and approve the meeting minutes from the 17th. I can't remember. Do we comment? Do we discuss or do we motion first? Community Action House. We do it the other way. Is that wrong? Well, that must be me being in charge of that board. Okay, so do I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
I moved.
Thank
Seconded.
you. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Boyd. Any discussion on the meeting minutes from May? Alrighty, all in favor of approving the meeting minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Thank you, Travis and Boyd. Public comment time. Would anyone in the audience like to make a comment to us publicly? Alrighty. Then we will receive and acknowledge the online public comments that were submitted this time around. I'm assuming we've read through them. Can I get a motion to receive and acknowledge them? Thank you, Travis. A second?
Second.
Thanks, Jeff. Any discussion or comments on the online submissions? All right, all in favor of submitting them as written and acknowledging them?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Thank you, Travis and Jeff.
Brian, maybe some housekeeping here that Dave and I talked real briefly about. I think I know the answers, but just so everyone knows.
Oh, we didn't do roll call. Oh, man. Do
I've-
we have to start all over?
I've got you. We'll call it.
Stop, everybody leave, we'll come back in and start this.
That'd be great.
I think what we'll continue to do is we'll continue to record these meetings. You know, COVID was kind of weird, so we recorded more meetings than what we did, but I think for the importance of this group and continuity, you know, as a team, that we'd continue to videotape the meetings if the group agreed. And I think we'll continue to do the online public comments, even though people can come to the meetings more easy.
Yeah.
At some point, I don't know if we'll continue to do online public comments for all our meetings, you know, for the rest of time. But I think for the purposes of this group, I think we'll continue to do that unless
Yeah.
you all thought we'd change course.
It's good by me if it's good by everybody else. Yeah.
That's what I figured, but I thought it'd be worthwhile just to mention and kind of confirm that understanding with all of you.
Yeah. No, that's
Good.
great. Thanks. The transparency is good. All right. So, Travis and I sent you guys a document about 10 or so days ago, and your jobs were to review and come with questions, comments, reflections. It's the rough draft of our report. PJ and Tim, we knew we're not going to be here today, and they sent me and Travis some emails ahead of time, so I thought I would just kick us off by reading what they had to say, and then the rest of us could jump in. Sound like a plan?
So do they respond kind of lever by lever, and we'll kind of go through lever by lever with their stuff, or do they have more general?
PJ's he acknowledged them by levers.
Yeah, and
I didn't get Tim's at all.
I got Tim's. I probably should have shared with you. He had he had a comment on the electric portfolio, and then he had a comment on building energy consumption and transportation. So yeah, that's good. Why don't we just start with the first lever, and we'll add the comments from PJ and Tim as we go through the levers. That makes good sense. Jeff, thanks.
And Mr. Chair, we're going to try to pull it up on the screen.
Yeah, let's do that.
And then I think Ted's over there, could probably drive around as we need to move it up and down
Thanks.
I have
for
a
those
question,
watching in
Jane,
the audience.
about
Yeah,
this.
Nikki.
Is this in addition to what we already have written in our, the other draft, or is it a substitute, or is it an addendum, or complementary?
I think that my take is we'll get alignment on this, and then take the things from the other report that we liked and add it to and around this. I think that this is the meat of
This is
the
okay.
report.
Okay. And the other question, hi, Scott.
Hi, Scott.
Does this include, as the other community energy plan did, does it include only Holland and not the entire BPW service area? Did we ever?
I think
say
that if the CEP were to extend into the territories beyond the city, that would have to be something that we would need to be recommending in the report. As I understand it, we're all about the city.
Okay. Thank you.
it's complicated.
Yeah, I was
guess.
gonna say, some of the levers
So
certainly
like the
impact the
portfolio,
townships.
you know, the portfolio of the BPW obviously applies to the entire territory. But the city and the BPW as it relates to, like this, I'll just say the city. We elect the green energy rate. Well, we don't have the ability and to tell the townships what to do or not to do, and so there's no other way to say it. It's not clear cut.
Okay. That's all. We had just, that was a question at the beginning, and I just wondered if anything had been,
Yeah, I mean, Keith,
Going
maybe
further
this
on
is,
that.
my understanding is basically it's city, but if some of the things happen to also, because of the surface area, spill over and affect the service area, that's incidental to our recommendations, but just so happens to infect broader things. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, that's probably the best way to think about it.
There's like for rebate programs, for instance, there's not like a rebate program for businesses in the city that's
Yeah, so
different than the townships.
Right.
Like the BPW rebate program is,
Right, but so those
same.
programs that are required to be throughout the whole territory are, but that's kind of incidental to.
If you set goals for electric portfolio, that's gonna affect the entire BPW service territory.
Right.
Programs that the BPW would run, like an energy waste reduction program, affect the entire service territory. On-bill financing and home energy retrofit, for example, is a specific program within the city, is authorized by a statute that says the local jurisdiction has to create the clean energy program. So that's really kind of bound to the city in terms of a specific program. So it kind of depends, but, if the strategy to pursue some sort of reduction in the city is a broader application like an electric portfolio or energy waste reduction, it's going to have an effect on the entire service territory.
But like we couldn't install electric car chargers in Zealand or some other spot. So it's muddy because you can't control all those factors, which is the thing that is really challenging about doing this is you don't control most of the stuff actually. You're making suggestions with the hopes that other people come on board with it. So
yeah, that's true. And suggestions and more. I mean, encouragement and
oh sure, absolutely.
Pathways to.
To the extent that you can do it, that we control.
Yeah.
That's what we're saying is if it's in the city and it's a city controlled thing, then yes, but what we don't control,
Right.
we can only influence by suggesting, offering, educating, those kind of things. So
it might be worth, as we think about the final report and we're thinking about, I know this has come up a few times, like sort of calling out visually, like who's most responsible or most accountable for different pieces of all of these different things. Another layer to that visualization might be what is like only within the city and what is, I don't know if that would even be applicable or not, but there's an element of this where we could actually call that distinguishment out in the report, right? Like the portfolio applies to all the service territory. The strategy 4 in the built environment only applies to the city and not the townships. And I made that up as an example. That could be another, whatever, we could come up with some sort of way to visualize that and call that out such that anybody in the township in a particular township or within the city might be able to easily see like, 70% of these things are applicable or not. I don't know, it could be a way to visualize it.
Yeah, and there's another thing going on, which we all know, right? But it's good to talk it out and understand it too. So we've got the thing that's going on as far as the BPW boundary is different than the city boundary, which is really primarily what we're talking about here. But then you're also getting sections of, then that introduces townships that are maybe in the BPW boundary but aren't within the city boundary. But then we're also talking about things that you have control over and you don't have control over, which is a whole nother layer on top of all of this. So we've had a conversation with you all, for example, like in the Ann Arbor report, there was a particular section that talked about like who's the owner stakeholder, which we thought was good language from that Ann Arbor report, learning from, other that really talked about that. And then Nikki, that's where I go to, like, okay, there's encouragement, but there's strategies too of who's best to encourage and who's maybe not best to encourage different groups to do or not do something. And that's a whole nother conversation,
Sure.
right?
And there are layers to this, and
Right.
that is not this layer right now.
I guess I don't know, because you asked a perfectly appropriate open-ended question, but
Yeah, I think I would just say, Nikki, when we put this together, again, we were not trying to bake the cake. We were trying to just get all the ingredients on the table, is my analogy. And so we were trying to get some ingredients on the table, and we can choose what kind of cake we bake and what you cook it at and everything else. So I think some of these things we can add into this. And what Brian was referring to is, once we decide on, like, are we in agreement with these goals and do these strategies seem to make sense, then then we can start to talk about the stuff that Brian just brought up. Like, do we put in there who's in control, or who's the primary audience, or what jurisdiction does this cover? Do we create a little map that things are highlighted, or there could be little keys to every one of these that shows up, so that when someone's looking at it, they can get some quick reference to exactly who this is applicable to or who it's not applicable to. Because some things are targeting business, some things are targeting residential. There's a lot of different moving parts to this, and not everybody is going to have a game to play with each particular goal, but some entities might have more to do in one area, one lever than another.
Okay.
So,
Let's move on.
Cool. So I think, Jeff, you were alluding to this, and that's, as I've been thinking about how we best do this today, I think it just does make sense to like start at the first lever, and we'll just work our way down and see how far we get. We do have today and the 28th, if we need it, to get through all of this and get everybody's feedback and questions and everything. So, so is that good to start at the top, work our way down? Okay, great. So the first lever being the electric portfolio, we wrote the goal is to continue to shift Holland electric portfolio with emission levels that align current climate science and federal guidelines, align with current climate science, federal guidelines, while maintaining excellence in reliability and affordability. So I'll start with Tim, who had a comment on this. Because he's not here, we'll go with him first. So he says the goal is, I'm just reading this verbatim, the goal is well written and addresses reliability and affordability. I firmly believe that we must all be on the same page on this subject. Over 80% of electricity provided by Holland BPW is consumed by industrial and commercial customers, and we must be able to provide reliable and affordable electricity to retain and attract businesses to sustain our local GDP. It is a key to our future success as a community.
Sounds like you're running for office.
Sounds like a longstanding BPW board member. So that's what Tim had to say on that. And then PJ had a comment on the target, but why don't we read the target? Or, well, I guess, does anyone have any comments or questions on the goal?
Are you opening it up? Just
I
go
am.
ahead and go through PJ's, and then we can.
Well, his comment was on the target, so
Oh, I see.
we'll stop right in the beginning. How's that goal read, everybody?
Yeah, I could start with a thought or two. Overall, I like the separation of levers, by the way, this approach. So it's much easier to even focus when you think through the goals and targets. This was excellent. The mention of federal guidelines just stuck me in the eye a little bit, and feel like a broader stroke mentioning regulatory guidelines as state maybe evolves, local maybe evolves, and you have federal laid on. It could be international. You know, I know in banking standards, you know, there was a movement more to international standards. So I think a regulatory mention is more to be a bigger catch-all to stay in tune and stay current on regulatory guidelines.
So delete federal and insert regulatory.
Yeah, just a broader arching. You know, then you're staying in tune with all different international, federal, state, and local.
How does that strike other people?
It's a good change.
I like it, yeah. It's not
Is there
specific.
an element, and I think that sounds, Boyd, fine to me, I guess, is there an element of, like, if an international guideline is stricter or less strict than the federal, which is stricter or less strict than the state, which is stricter or less strict than the local, by not naming one of those levels, are we basically
We
not
could,
naming a goal?
we could, you know, if we stick with federal, then it raises a whole bunch of questions for me of what then? I don't know what those are. So let's, you know, if we could change it to regulatory, we align with current best practices around. I mean, there is a way to soften that up so that you're constantly evaluating, but you're not pinned, that you're in compliance with it. So there is a way to soften up that you're aware, you're evaluating, that it's a constant process to stay current, you know, to stay evaluating, which I think is a goal in itself. Not falling behind and understanding what the movement is, because this is going to move fast. I mean, this is going to be 10 years from now. I'm just trying to picture. I mean, this is going to move fast.
It won't be anything like it.
I know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just even saying the goal is almost to stay, you know. I like aligned. I mean, aligned is, there's room there, right?
Yeah,
I
and
don't
I didn't
think.
say in compliance with.
Oh,
It
yeah,
says
and I don't think
aligned.
we wanted to say it would be that, because you may wanna be better than that too, right? So we don't wanna pin ourselves down to like, we are just saying we're going to match whatever that is.
Right.
But
And
alignment can be at least equal to, but could be greater than.
Right.
Does it have to say anything, align current climate science guidelines? Is that just too open? I mean, then you're not regulatory, then you're not federal. You're not anything, it's guidelines.
Well,
I don't know.
climate science itself can go both ways.
Yeah.
I can go out and find plenty of things out there
Mm.
that is considered climate science, and it's saying we don't have a problem.
Well,
It's nature at work. I mean, so, you know, I think bringing in regulatory concepts is okay, because it says that society, in a bigger way, is adopting some rules and guidelines in different places. I just didn't know if federal's the only thing we really need to focus on.
I'm really concerned how broad you get with that definition, though, because, you know, we look at the European model using nuclear power. You know, they're not so reliant on fossil fuels.
Could
and-
say US
and
regulatory.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because when we start saying too broad, too overarching, we're comparing ourselves all over the world, and it's very difficult. So, and it can be variations of that. So I would say we use a little caution with how broad we go with that definition. But I'm trying to be very reserved on. I know I'm on the committee, but I also want to make sure that as a councilman, I don't overstep,
Yeah.
guiding you guys to a direction.
Now, state bodies are currently formed and talking, right? That they may not align with federal, and then we could have political regime changes at the federal level that drastically changes what that means too.
So the words that stand up to me in this that I liked were continue to shift and align. The beginning and the align were, like, there's a lot of, like, basically the goal is we want to keep moving the target to be in alignment with whatever best practices, climate science, regulatory, like that's like the overarching goal with the portfolio, I think, is to continue. It's a living document sort of approach of like, we want to continue to shift to be in alignment. Those words to me protect a lot of these really, really appropriate like rabbit holes that I think could be a gotcha. And then at the very end of the document, part of what Travis and I put in there was like governance recommendations on how this thing should function, which would also get at the ability to adjust this in a shorter order than, 10 years or what have you. So I'm not fighting for the exact language. I'm just inviting you into sort of what Travis and I were trying to think through as what would the goal be around the portfolio. So yeah, unless there's, so anyways, comments on those thoughts? Jeff, you were going to say something about climate science, so I don't want that to.
So I guess
go
I would
unsaid.
fight for the continue to shift and align more than any of the other specific language. I think Boyd's comment, like I would be on board with that. I think that's a positive change. I don't see necessarily that directly ties us to specific, like if there's federal changes or state changes, it doesn't tie us to either of those specifically. I mean, I think the rest of the report lays out more specifically what we're thinking. So I don't see that ties us necessarily to some cart that we don't want to be hitched to. But I think the continuing to shift and I would fight to keep climate science in there as a word.
Yeah.
But those would be the ideas that I think are more important.
So you like regulatory in place of federal,
I think
which
that's
is fine.
I think that's good. I
Okay.
think I like that it broadens it and doesn't tie us to federal standards, which may get relaxed in 4 years. I don't know. And I don't think we necessarily want to, like, if federal standards do or don't get put in place, I don't think we want to hitch our cart to that wagon specifically. I think we want to hitch our wagon to continuing to shift and aligning with climate science.
Okay. Dave.
My only comment is, regulations tend to speak to things that have been codified as a limitation on utilities or on generating units, and there really isn't a regulation, governing an electric portfolio's carbon emissions. And since the language in here in the goal speaks to aligning the emissions to a regulation, I know that maybe it's broad enough in terms of how it's speaking about, but that does not exist, today. What does is the guidelines, I guess, or the discussion that's out there about a 50% reduction from 2005 levels, and I know you're going to get to that when you speak about the target. That's not a regulation as much as it is sort of a thought process around a level of emissions necessary to control climate related impacts. And so that the only thing about regulation in my mind that gets a little bit concerning is just the fact that it doesn't really exist today in terms of how this is structured.
Right.
But should they evolve, we are putting a stake in the sand that says we'll align, right?
Okay, let's keep moving, and we'll put a pin in that. I imagine that won't be the last time I say that today. But yeah, I don't know that I don't want to try and solve every wordsmith detailed word today, but that's a good discussion, and we can circle back on it should we have time today, later, or next time. So then we move to so if that's the goal or something very close to that is the goal, which sounds like everybody's good with something very close to that. The target that we listed is achieve 50% reduction from 2005 levels in total carbon emissions from electric production by 2030, which, as Dave was referencing, is the recent guideline that President Biden talked about, I don't know, in the last 8 weeks or something like that. And a lot of other countries and whatnot are shooting towards. So that's the target that we put. Tim did not have a specific comment on that. I will read PJ's. Let me see here. All right, reading verbatim here. Under the key lever, electric portfolio, the target, I'm not going to reread the, he says, achieving 50% reduction from 2005 levels in total carbon emissions from electricity production by 2030 is a very focal pronouncement. This will garner, focal, he said, this will garner a lot of attention. We may need to provide substantial qualitative explanation for this. Did he mean quantitative there? Probably quantitative.
Probably.
Anyways, one letter can make a lot of difference. From my view, it is a very good target. I think it presents both a meaningful and reasonable challenge. A question pertaining, I'll stop there. He's got comment on the some of the strategies. So that was PJ's comment, is he liked it. And we need to either have qualitative or quantitative support. One, probably both. Comments or questions on the target?
I have a comment.
Yeah, Nikki.
And I had asked you what 50%, what were the 2005 levels? And I did look up the report from the government that you, part of President Biden's comments on where we want to be. And that would be a federal statement. Do we want, like, when we say total carbon emissions in Holland from BPW, what are we moving from? Because I think the other question down the line comes, and you had mentioned it earlier, is the accountability. So how do we know? Where did we start? And so in like your comments, yours and Travis's comments at the end, we'll have to do this probably every 3 years because things are changing so quickly. How do we know where we started? Because we need to be accountable for the next group to say, you know, we missed our target, or we're on target to beat our target, or whatever. So you have where's our start, and how do we be accountable to know where we're going and if we hit that target?
And then Nikki, if I could add on to that, that 2005 number did catch me off guard, because the baseline report in the past really worked off 2010. So all the charts and the base cases, the scenarios, were all a 2010 marker. So it felt like was that a conscientious pivot from 2010 history for this plan to 2005? Can you help us understand that?
How conscious of a pivot was that, Travis, for us? I think we were.
I didn't know if it was like calculated or if it was just.
I think, Dave, we have 2005 numbers, right, for baselines?
Yeah, we do.
Yes.
Yeah, saw the Biden. So here's how calculated it was in my mind. Saw the Biden announcement. Asked Dave if we have 2005 numbers, and thought that sounds good. I don't know if it was more calculated.
Yeah, and if I can just clarify too, because I think this will help clarify Nikki's question as well. Hopefully, you mentioned where's the accountability, where we start. Again, just a reminder: this particular target is about the electric portfolio, not about the entirety of
The whole plan.
the whole plan.
Yeah.
So it's really on that element of it.
Yep.
And so we do have those numbers because we have, what units were producing power at that time and what the carbon levels of emissions were. So we know what that was at that time.
Is that data you guys have every year, basically, based off
Yeah.
of your production mix and everything?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And put it out.
Does it cause any confusion with the old charts, 2010 through 2050, as laid out in our old chapter 3, showing the different scenarios, and it picked up at 2010. So I don't know, all the math and all the history behind this built off of that anchor.
Yeah, and I don't know that I don't even know, this is part of the discussion, how much easier or harder it is to hit those numbers from 05 to
Okay.
10. I don't even know. So
I don't know, there's a lot of change between 05 and 10, but I think, back to your point of if you're going to align, if the goal is to align, then aligning with what's being said at the federal level, and that federal level guidance is a 2005 baseline associated with it.
And
So-
that, I think, was really all we were trying to do, was align with something that everybody else was trying to align to at
Gotcha.
this point. So,
So,
and we have information, and we asked Dave if we have that information, and he said, yeah, we do, so.
Yeah, Jeff.
Just one comment. I mean, that's, if you look back at the 2005 number, this is a very modest goal, right? Because 2005, we had in Holland, I don't remember what it was, 75% of the electricity was coal. So we went from, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I think 2005 to 18 was a 46% reduction. Is that correct?
2010 to 18 was a 46% reduction, yes, in the intensity per
So
megawatt hour, not in
which was
terms
not the
of,
total amount.
right, because there was growth in the actual
Correct.
usage, yes.
But was it 2010 to 18 or 2005 to 18?
2010 to 18.
Okay, so 2005 to 18 was a little bit more than
Maybe a little
that.
bit more, but not a lot more. It was, again, our portfolio didn't change a whole lot until, say, post-2010.
Nor
You
did the
know.
population, right? We were pretty.
Well, the population's been pretty stagnant, but we've had growth, though, in terms of electricity sales. Industry has grown, even though the population has been flat. So our energy needs have grown, and therefore our overall carbon emissions have grown, offset by the moves that have been made in shifting the portfolio between primarily 2010 and 2018, and continues to shift as we add more like solar into the mix now. So, yeah.
Then maybe we should
Okay,
align it
so-
with 2010.
So from,
Or we need to explain it.
and again,
that's
I guess,
not-
so just so that we're all on the same page. So from 2005 to 18, we had ballpark 50% reduction in carbon intensity, but a little bit more than, a little bit less than that. We didn't meet our 2030 goal because there was more electricity.
Yeah, I don't know if we're at 50% in terms of the intensity. We might be just north of the
Just
46%,
close-
actually. It's pretty close to the
close-ish.
46, but there's been growth between 2005 and 2010, and then there's been growth again between 2010 and today. So actually, it's making it harder, because if you go to the 2005 baseline, you have to account for your electric sales growth
From
between 2005 and
05
2010.
I think 2005 is a reasonable base case, because that's kind of what's been agreed upon nationally. I mean, if you look at carbon intensity, and again, Dave, maybe you can correct these numbers or give a little bit more definition, but it's about 50% or so is from forget the names, the Bell River and the Campbell plant. So is it about 50%?
Let me double check that before I say that that's what it is, but
It's
I
at
mean,
least like, looking at the graphs, I don't have the actual
Yeah.
numbers in my head, but looking at the graphs is ballpark.
they're a very sizable portion of it, are
Ballpark
those two. yeah.
50%?
Right, of which one of those two resources will be retired by 2030, but not the other one. So there will be
Correct.
one of the two, yeah.
But, okay, so, I mean, my take, we can fall backwards into a 50% reduction by 2030.
I would not agree with that. The sales growth that we're seeing and continue to see on the industrial side will really eat up a lot of that. And so intensity, if the goal or the target is the intensity per megawatt hour that's sold, I
agree, that's easy.
I agree that you will fall into that. But as far as the total carbon emissions, because of the growth of the industrial, there's a lot there. So that would be the concern, I think, on that. But just my comment on that.
Jeff, I think that's why we're struggling is when in the 2010 analysis, it gave a base case of a bit of a do nothing, or I don't know if it was a do nothing, but it did give you those projections out to 2020, 2025, 2030. You could kind of see if we don't do anything. And then it gave you other scenarios. We're missing that from 2005 for just the electrical portfolio, because the other graphs were transportation was included, there's other things in there. So I can't picture where would we be before we set this target if we do nothing based on 2005, if it's kind of run rate base case stuff. Or not nothing, but Dave, having the EWR, baked in there and things like that, just a base case. So it's a struggle to see the reality of this target without something like they did in 2010.
Yeah, I guess I would be reticent to choose a target like 50% without looking more closely at what exactly the numbers look like today and what would be a reasonable, achievable target. I mean, I guess I'm more pessimistic about the future of coal power. I mean, I know that the plans currently for the Campbell plant, I think, is 2040. I know I just saw
Correct.
a fairly recent analysis looking at kind of the Indiana service territory, looking at the future financial viability of coal plants in Indiana, which is like center of coal country. And they were projecting out 75% of the coal power in Indiana was going to be basically dead weight by 2023. So I'm not sure if the 2040 number will stick. And if that doesn't stick, then, you know, if both coal plants are retired by 2030 and they're replaced by anything else. So I don't know. I guess I would be interested in looking at like what is the actual total carbon like not just carbon intensity, but what is the total carbon emissions 2005 to today, and then be able to project that out a little bit so we have
We can bring up,
better numbers to work with.
we can bring up the integrated resource plan again, which was, you know, accounting for, the retirement path of, Bell River, and also accounting for the load growth that will be anticipated for our service territory. I think the number that is in the target represents the plan that has a carbon constrained case. So if you look at the cases within the IRP and you look at the carbon constrained case, the number that's in this target, I think, represents fairly closely that result. But again, that is a good resource document for this group to look at, and I certainly can help point to specific information within it that it would help you with that, or we can pull it up here at some point if we need to.
And I just want to make sure I was hearing you right, Jeff. So, and you just correct me if I don't get this. I need it like a kindergartner usually. What you're saying is this doesn't, you don't believe this represents something very very hard to achieve, because you believe that one of the coal plants that we're under contract for into 2040 is actually going to proactively decommission way before that, because the market is just, that's where the market is just driving it.
I think whether the market drives it there, which I think probably will happen. I mean, if you look at coal power in Michigan, every coal plant is scheduled to close by 2040.
Yeah.
So there's I think one in Escanaba that's not currently scheduled to close, and it's a little dinky thing. So the fact that like we've closed in the last 10 years, 50% of the coal plants in Michigan, and everyone is scheduled to close in the next 20 years. I guess I see, and even like going back to the IRP, the carbon constrained case is still shooting for an end scenario in, say, 2050 that is fairly carbon intensive. So I guess I question like whether that's the end goal that we want to be achieving, or whether we want to be achieving something that's different than that end goal in 2040 or 2050.
But if projections are, as you're suggesting, that we'll get a break from that, we also have an intensity or an increase in use. I mean, there's more need for energy. So we're going to be combating that as well. So why wouldn't one take advantage of the fact that something may close, and we can benefit from that, certainly. But at the same time, we know we have these other energy requirements that are going to be needed in the future for the growth that we're looking at. So I think we're still going to have that. We're still going to have some difficulties achieving this as well, as a community, as a city, as we grow.
My sense, Jeff, is that if like the hypothetical closing of a coal plant that's not set to close is not something we can really factor or plan for.
I agree.
So if this, with what we know right now, if this represents a much more aggressive plan and target than what we currently have, before this report gets released, then I'd like us to just think about it from that perspective, and how it fits into the entire plan, and where the whole carbon per capita ends up at the end. And then leave room for the people who stay on the committee in the years to come to adjust as Campbell falls off or what have you. Yeah, that would be.
No,
There's-
that's important to note. I agree with that, Keith.
Because we have contracts. That's why.
Yeah, I mean, the decision to close or not close are outside of our control. And I think Jeff, acknowledges
I
that
understand
and
that.
have.
Yeah.
But we could disengage ourselves from them.
Well, you could contractually, but you still have to pay.
Yes, right.
So, I mean, you can, right.
To be clear.
You'd still be on the
Well, it's
hook.
not that, we're not recommending that, but it is possible to,
And if you're
But you would be
paying,
paying and not getting the electricity.
and you would still be paying for them to burn coal,
Yeah, it
which
wouldn't
means you're
change.
still
Right.
causing
It
the
doesn't-
problem.
It
I'm
wouldn't
just
help
saying
anything.
that-
Doesn't help the
that's
environment,
Just to
yeah.
say what the actual situation.
I think it's
right.
really important to be clear here, Dave.
Yeah,
Correct, yes. So we don't have a relationship with those operators of those plants. Michigan Public Power Agency has the partial ownership in those plants, but they're a minority owner. They're not the operator. They don't get to make the decisions. We have power purchase commitments to Michigan Public Power Agency that make us financially responsible for whatever that plant incurs in terms of costs. And that plant's dispatch decisions are not going to be affected by us in terms of any sort of decision. So if we were to, I'm not sure what the words were, like disengage, I don't think we can disengage because we have this relationship with MPPA, so we'll always be engaged. The question that came up earlier in the SDT process was buying renewable energy credits to cover the fact that the plant is emitting power. And we would, yes, pay for that, and then the plant still would emit carbon. You're not going to change that scenario. And we'd pay the cost of the fuel, and we'd pay for the plant's O&M and any other capital expenditures that would be needed for the plant, as well as the decommissioning costs of that plant. So those are all financial obligations that we have that would not change the dispatch parameters of that plant at all. So that's the situation that we're in with those.
Thank you.
Yeah. Or as I like to think about it, no matter what, it's still going to burn coal and we still have to pay money.
and I know that, just to be clear that this is all
Yeah.
the situation.
Yeah. So Jeff, we can, again, this is a committee, Travis and I, we threw this out here. The committee is going to make a decision on what all these things are. So if there's a specific, different target that you'd like us to consider, or you want to follow up with the IRP and get back to us, or ask Dave a more specific question around numbers and projections that obviously I can't answer, please do that. And, cause we want everybody to feel good and have something that's, as aggressive as we can make it and achievable as we can make it. So I think that this, at least to Travis and I, struck as more aggressive things to do than what's currently, a real thing, what's actually happening, and then we can go from there if we want to get more aggressive than that down the road.
I guess where I'm coming from, I think, I think we have to understand electricity is the most important thing for transitioning from a carbon-intense economy to a not carbon-intense economy. So this is also the lever that we have the most control over. So I think we have to, with that number, 50% is a nice round number, but should it be 54%? I don't know, what is that achievable? So I think that's a number, I guess I'm arguing for, I think we have to dive into that number and make it aggressive. I understand we don't have the power to close Campbell. But I think we have to drill into what actually is that 50% scenario. Is it reasonable to push it higher? Is it something that, or is it something that maybe 50% is the highest that we can reasonably push it and we should stop there? But I think that's in my
Yeah.
opinion, that's the most important number in the whole thing, that Holland directly has not control over all of it, but as much control over anything else that's in this whole thing, pretty much.
I appreciate that. I don't know what the appropriate way to, I mean, is that like you and Dave get drinks sometime and do some math or what? Like,
No, I would, although I would certainly welcome that for some other reason, we can get together. But, you know, as far as this is concerned, I would be in favor of probably sharing some information from the integrated resource plan, pulled out some very specific areas there where you can see what that looks like. And the group can weigh that and decide whether or not 50%. And I could share with you the 2005 number, just so you have that, as opposed to 2010, as opposed to 2018, which was recently calculated, and then we can give you the IRP numbers for 2030 at the various cases.
Yeah.
So you can see what that looks like as a percentage of raw. The other piece of the IRP, I think it's important, that's not really mentioned here in the target at all, but, you know, and I think there's been discussions about the, you know, drawing similarities to the Ann Arbor presentation of this information, and maybe something to consider too is, okay, so this is the goal. What assumptions is that based upon? Is that based upon a large manufacturer, you know, locating in Holland, Michigan, and the energy needs of that comes along with it? Do we suddenly start saying that we don't want that because it impacts our ability to meet the carbon target, or we just base the lever target on some certain set of assumptions? And do we want to clarify what those assumptions are? I think it's something for the SDT to consider too.
I would be personally I would be in favor of tying that, and so whether it, I don't know how we directly want to do that, but looking not only at the total carbon, but at carbon intensity. Because right, if for Dave's scenario, right, if Amazon, instead of building in, I don't know where they just put a headquarters, if they build in Holland, Michigan, like that's a huge energy user, and we want that because you want that business. And if they're relocating here, they're not relocating somewhere else. So it's not like, right, I mean, global carbon doesn't care whether it's in Holland, Michigan or in Lexington, Kentucky. It's wherever it ends up being. So, yeah, I mean, tying ourselves to 50% or whatever it is total is great, but I think, I don't know exactly what language you want to do around that, whether it's like an either or kind of within these bounds of, you know, kind of where we set projected demand.
I'm not going to answer a question there, Jeff, but I'm even going to put a little bit sharper point on the hypothetical. May not even be Amazon. It may even be, I don't know, like a company that makes batteries.
Yeah.
Right? That is a huge user of electricity.
Yeah.
And yet you would say, wow, is really
Which you absolutely want here and not somewhere else.
Here, and adding more electrification out in the world, right?
Which
As a
you
result, yeah.
exactly want.
so it is complex, and that's where the targets get really interesting,
And-
right? Because then they can come back and kind of go, well, the target, so then don't make this decision. And it's like, okay, well, that's not really what we set that target for potentially. So I think the pause and the really unpacking this a little bit is well taken.
and Dave, I know that you had put together a bit of a at least high level spreadsheet calculating a bunch of the stuff that we had put into this, and I know that we haven't circulated that, but I'm thinking of that, or actually Travis thought of that, which is a better thought than I had. Is that spreadsheet that you have, would that get at what Jeff is asking, or are we not quite, you know, we can circulate that after the fact, but I don't know how much Jeff, I don't understand how much detail you're like looking for to be able to go, no, not 50, 54.
No, I don't know that
but-
spreadsheet is really going to assist in that. That spreadsheet was really meant to take your work
Yeah.
and say, okay, if I took the 2018 numbers that we've presented to this group before and said, I took these targets that you're sharing and beginning to work on, what would the resulting amount of carbon in each of these areas of the pie end up being? And that's where I think, you know, as part of your conversation, you floated in this document here that we'd get to 13.4.
Yeah.
That was really the outcome of just applying math to your work.
Yeah.
And so, but the IRP is the better source of information to really sort of get you a sense as a group as to whether or not 50% is the right number, 50% or an intensity of this amount, or, what is exactly the right target, to have in this lever.
Yeah.
So it's more of the
A little
IRP data
higher.
probably.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, the IRP, months ago, it feels like looking at it.
Yeah.
Not feels
And
like.
It was,
It
actually.
was. And it really did paint a
Everything
very
has
good
been months
picture
ago.
of here to there. My mind, I think I'm there on this if I can just picture the 2005 sort of baseline and where we're at. Because we talked a number of times too about how we write. Had nothing been done, I still think it's really important that the final output says, looking back, a number of great things have been done. We're here at 19 metric tons now. Had nothing been done, you can see the original base case. I looked it up, 34. So the original base case from the 2010 work showed 34 metric tons per capita by 2030.
If we do nothing.
Did nothing. So there's another way to look at this too, cutting 2/3 is what this is really doing versus, but I can't picture that 2005 reality yet because I've been, in 2010. And I think the commentary of why we went to 2005 is short and simple and sweet. I'm there now, right? I understand it, and I think that gets built off of. But I'm with Jeff. It's just a little bit more numbers oriented. What did that path look like? Where we're at now? The IRP does it almost, but it doesn't take you back to 2005.
Yeah.
And you and Jeff both used the word aggressive. Am I?
Yep, you're right.
And so, how aggressive do we want to be? What's driving our change here? I mean, is it reducing carbon footprint to attract business, to make our, what is it? Because I think that affects the numbers, and then you have, is it climate change? Is it climate science? Is it just sustainability? Is it, because then you set this goal, and I always come back to being accountable for it. So you want to know what's driving it.
So the mission, Nikki? You mean the mission? We've gotten to the goals. What was the mission?
Well, that
So
was
missions
2
and
months ago.
values,
That was
right?
3 months ago.
Yeah.
So maybe easier for me to say than our general manager of our BPW, but they have had for a long time really a three-pronged strategy. And you look back to the original formation of the documents, they've always said three things, right? They've said the, different words that you've used, right? But they've always said environment, they've always said reliability, they've always said affordability. And if you take a look at being aggressive, yeah, they made an early aggressive action on here that really carried most of the weight on it, and it was a $270 million investment.
240, but that's
240,
yeah.
Where'd that other 30 go,
Yeah.
Keith?
Where'd that other 30 go?
Swimming pool?
I think.
Well, I
no,
said,
I
well, I
think
was
we
like-
know where.
Yeah, where are you playing golf on weekends?
So I think there's been consistency and there's been reporting on that number.
Okay, so Dave, can you?
Yeah, we'll get
do
the,
some numbers
yeah, we'll
off
get
of the 05
Yep.
for Boyd and Jeff, and then we can.
Well, I'd like everybody to have it. I think you all should have it, probably just so, and I'll get it to the entire SDT, but it would be 2005 numbers, and I'll get you the 2010, 2018 numbers. And then we'll get you the IRP resulting situation that was based upon, again, a certain assumption of load growth and, continuation of a energy waste reduction program. Actually, we have an enhanced energy waste reduction program case. So we'll have that will give you a sense of what that number looks like in 2030. And you can wrestle with that then and see if, and I can also give you probably the intensity numbers for each of those periods so you can have a sense of what those are. So I don't have to have you digging through all the details of the IRP. I'll just kind of pull it out so you have that right in front of you.
Would the 2005 IRP have shown trajectory out to 2030?
Well, the 2005, since they were basing it on the discussions at the federal level right now and about climate science and the need to cut from 2005 levels, they asked me about the 2005 numbers, and we
Yeah.
have those, but it doesn't mean that there was a 2005 IRP.
Gotcha.
Okay, so it's not a different IRP. It's more
Understand.
taking the historical actual and then calculating the actual
understand.
carbon emissions at
Okay.
that time.
But to the point, Jeff, you made, I mean, we chose 50 as we were looking at things and trying to come with reasonable, but something that would move the needle and trying to get us down to the 10 number that we were aiming for. So we got to the 13.4 without doing any carbon offsets, without doing, you know, there's a lot of other things that could be done to potentially get there, but we were just trying to like put something down so that we could do what we're doing right now. We had nothing to reflect on. So you want to move it to 54, move it to 54, right? I mean,
No,
I know
I-
I'm good with what
I
you're saying.
totally agree. I'm just saying that I think to my mind, that's one of the most important single numbers in the entire document.
Yeah.
We agree.
We
That-
should
and that's why
drill
we-
into that and make sure that that is correctly set.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that's why we led with it as the number one up at the top too.
Yeah.
So
And
I totally agree.
Yeah, and I think it is worth noting that we didn't have a intensity number on there. Assuming the community grows as everyone is imagining it will and has, we thought this was more aggressive than intensity number because of it. You know, it's an absolute
Yeah.
number. So, yeah, obviously, if a bunch of companies in town leave, then that's a different story. But so, anyways, yeah, no, but
So yeah, I guess I would kind of and maybe this is too much for the target, but I would tie it like a 50%. Or whatever percent we do from 2005 levels in total carbon emissions, assuming 1% growth per year in load or something like that. So you tie it in some way to kind of both at the same. I don't know if that's the way to do it, but
So you mean it'd be scalable?
yeah, I think that we're probably
It's
gonna.
interesting.
No, it's a really good point. I think.
But then maybe then why don't you just do the emissions factor? But anyway, I don't know.
Well,
It's interesting though.
well, and I think that just calls out a potential category though in each of these though. Under you could easily do a goals, targets, strategies, and possible actions, and then assumptions, like section under each one, unless there already is one and I just totally botched it. No. So, you could have an assumption section under the strategies, and you can have an accountability section underneath that, right? So that's where we could,
Yeah.
we
That'd be a
could
good
list
way to
all
handle
of that kind of stuff out. Because I think you're going to have assumptions in every single lever on all of this stuff, right?
Yeah, be a
So-
good way to handle it. Okay, I didn't mean to stop us for an hour. on the
No,
first
this
one.
is what we're doing. This is what we're doing here.
It brings up a good point though. I mean, if to sit there and talk next about strategies on a target that we're still evaluating, I mean, could we move through and talk goal, target through the document and hold off on strategy?
Yeah.
Because why talk strategies if we're just getting comfortable with targets and goals?
I am fine with that if other people are. If we don't have
Or
a
we'll
ton
be
of
here,
debate on the goal or strategy, then we could talk about the goal or the target. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, I just, if we're gonna move on to either strategies or on to a different lever, I guess, one more thing that I seem to glean a little bit from PJ's note, and I think he probably would wanna express if he was here as well. And it's not to put, again, this is putting out there for the SDT to wrestle with, but, the goal talks about aligning with climate science while maintaining affordability and reliability. But the only target that exists is the actual climate-related target. And I guess for the SDT, are there targets, and even if you just say yes and park it for discussion later, but should there be targets around affordability and reliability that are part of that?
And are they constraints or are they targets?
Yeah.
I move that the finance guy wrestle with that one for the next couple weeks.
And I didn't, speaking of PJ, and I didn't totally finish reading his comments, so I want to do that around the electric portfolio. So he finishes on the electric portfolio by saying, and Jeff, this will resonate. he says, would it be helpful to revisit the Holland BPW's integrated resource plan to capture more insights on the underlying realities, not just environmental protection, but capacity, capability, security, etc., pertaining to electric generation? Although climate protection is clearly an issue, recent events nationally, example Texas, have highlighted very serious issues, threats that a community energy plan should address. Also, there's a lot of emphasis on the portfolio of generation sources for electricity. Are we sufficiently illuminating the significant infrastructure investments our community would need to make to effectively modify our electric generation portfolio more towards decarbonization? In our community, there's been a lot of community input urging Holland to take the lead, quote unquote, take the lead in the area of climate protection through our community energy plan. Should we attempt to illuminate any of our proposed strategies as being early adopter, I'm thinking he's saying adopter tactics. Anyways, so he lifts up the IRP, he lifts up capacity, reliability, and then also just naming any early adopter stuff if we're doing any of that. So those are the last of PJ's comments regarding the electric portfolio lever.
Which goes back to mission, Nikki, and overall values not being. Because I start to look at cost as an interesting constraint, but I don't know if it's a target. And you can add on, a competitiveness concept around electricity costs, so that way the intent of it isn't to go outspend the benefits, the perceived community benefits, right? So part of me feels like cost, is one of those that's interesting. It's not mentioned. Should there be a constraint to remain competitive there? Reliability and affordability. I mean, back to our mission. Where do we start and stop here?
Yeah, I think if you were to, the encouraging thing related to that, Boyd, I think is that if, you went back 20 or 30 years and looked at the generation, how much everything cost versus now versus where it's going, I think more than likely there's alignment on, it's not like, oh, low cost is going to be coal, like we're not going to be having that conversation, it doesn't seem. So it's a good.
I think consumers are getting more sophisticated too. They know more, and some of this becomes market driven. I mean, it's smart as far as the environment goes. It's smart as far as how you manage it with reliability and affordability. But it's good marketing. It's good business.
My only point on that, I guess, too, to just follow on to what PJ's saying, is that if you do go back and look at the IRP, that different carbon outcomes had different costs in the integrated resource plan. So there is it's not like the lowest carbon is the lowest
Vastly
cost,
different
right?
costs.
And so it's a matter of, recognizing that element or not in terms of whether it's a target, whether it's not a target. Texas is mentioned by PJ, but it was interesting that on Thursday we had every piece of equipment running in Holland because we were called upon to do so here in the Midwest. And you think, well, it's spring yet. So that was kind of an interesting scenario for us to be in. But the grid operator in our area said, you must start everything. Even though we had all of our needs covered, we were actually pushing out into the grid. So
Do they give you an explanation as to why, out of curiosity?
there was a shortage of supply.
Just do they tell you like where?
Forced outages, but they didn't say exactly where they were.
Interesting.
Did that include our peakers?
Yes, all of them.
Wow.
When's the last time that happened?
I don't remember.
Wow.
So, yeah, that we were called to run all of them. Yeah.
Say, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, you don't. That's why you have peakers.
So, anyway, it's interesting, that's
Yeah.
why reliability and affordability, also is stated in the goal.
Yeah.
But whether they're constraints, whether they're targets, I don't know. I just wanted to support
Right.
PJ's comments.
Yeah, it's good.
Yes.
Boyd, I like your intuition around skipping the strategies and possible actions on this one in particular for now, and moving to the next lever, if that's good with everybody. All right. Alrighty. The next key lever we listed was the building energy consumption. So the goal was to reduce carbon emissions in the built environment. Anybody think that should be rewritten? It's a good goal.
Put more words in place. That's fine.
Okay. So a handful of targets here. I can read them all, or you can make comments on the ones you don't like. What would you like me to do?
I struggled all around because, again, data. I don't know what any of this equates to, means, benchmarks, baselines and stuff. I just struggled with it, And then also knowing the constraints that we have around regulatory in many cases, with building codes and things like that. I struggled too. So, not much help on this one other than it doesn't feel like I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Quantitatively understand it. I should say it that way, not qualitatively.
We had to ask,
L or N?
we had to ask Dave a lot of questions as we went through this, so, there's some, I understand what you're saying is what I'm getting at, Boyd, because we had to go to the person here who's dealing with it on site to really kind of pry at this stuff a little bit, and so that's where we got help on this one as we were writing it, so,
Okay.
just to be transparent.
So I guess where I see some potential issues, so target 2 and target 3/4 are in some ways competing. So if you're reducing natural gas use across customer categories, you may be increasing electricity consumption, which may not be a bad thing. So I guess if our target is reduced carbon emissions in the built environment, that may not necessarily mean reduced electricity, although obviously reduced electricity waste would be a good thing. That may not be reduced electricity usage. And this is where, I don't know, I mean, Dave maybe has more insight into like the EWR program, what that looks like and how you're planning to track that if there is an increase in electrification. Like, how do you distinguish things that are, this is a good increased electricity use and this is stuff that is somebody running a compressor and spraying off their workbench?
Yeah, it's hard to do a qualitative, without really being able to see granular information in every customer's usage, right? It's pretty difficult. So these that are here, I think, as they were represented to us, are just what they are, which are absolute numbers. They're not EWR outcomes. They're not energy waste reduction program targets. They are actual consumed power, consumed electricity, consumed natural gas will be down over the next 10 years by 10% in electricity and 15% in natural gas. And part of that natural gas would be the shift, would be target number 4, which is related to, now how do you get there? Well, SEMCO's still running an EWR program, energy waste reduction program, that would be similar to a 1% per year kind of target. So with 10 years and 1% per year, you get about a 10% reduction. You could also then encourage 5% shift to electricity, which is going to, hopefully, if you are successful, get you down 15%. But that doesn't account for, again, any growth, in either population or industry. So that, to achieve that number, you would pretty much need to have flat growth and then have a successful EWR program at SEMCO and a successful conversion of 5% of the loads in natural gas to electricity. On the electric side, 10% reduction in electricity from each customer class by 2030, we are, thanks to Ann and her team, going to be working towards a 2% electric energy waste reduction goal in electricity by 2024 calendar year. Next year is a 1.5, and then 1 3/4, and then up to 2%. So if you look at cumulatively between now and 2030, you might get north of 10%, not to 20% yet, but you're going to be maybe in that 15% range But again, if you're gonna absorb 5% of the electricity from the natural gas consumption, now I don't know if it's gonna be apples to apples because of the relative energy levels of natural gas versus electricity. But that's how you probably get closer to a 10% number with that. You can get closer. But again, that's not accounting for load growth. So I think these things have various assumptions associated with them. If you have, again, a battery manufacturer, hypothetically, decide to add a lot here, it's kind of hard to achieve absolute levels that are less than that. But again, whether you call those assumptions, whether you call those additional narrative in the report, whatever, you have to kind of start somewhere to lead yourself towards strategies that you want to implement. And so, that's, to the point Boyd said, I need numbers. Well, that's kind of where I think numbers that are supportive of that kind of thought process are related to the things that I just described.
Yeah,
That's helpful.
I think that target 5 should probably be moved to target 1 also, right, in terms of order. Like energy intensity metrics is really been a bit of a missing component for a lot of all of this, right? And so an intensity relative to, local GDP is something that we've talked a lot about, right? Like sales, energy use per widget produced or what have you, right? Like this is how we can measure that part, which I think is a big part. But these are what we went to Dave is we were like, we need, the pie, 70% of it basically is commercial and industrial buildings. So we're like, we need to make a big dent here. There seems to be a big opportunity here. So let's find some numbers that work for this level of committee and that, on a high level, Dave can feel reasonable about, given all of the assumptions and details aren't worked out, because that's not really our job. And can we, where does that get us? And so that's sort of, the theory behind where Trav and I started is the built environment is a real big opportunity. We need to be able to measure this stuff with more intelligence as it relates to the nuances of these buildings over time. And can we put some numbers on there that at the end, we're at 13 with these numbers and we feel okay about that. Boyd, sans a pro forma like that.
No,
That's
but
it.
That commentary helps a lot. Because what I'm thinking through in my own mind is, okay, in a new built environment that has better materials, better standards, possibly even regular, code that comes out in the future.
Well, and the code
that
thing is-
offsets some of the growth.
Yeah.
Possibly. And then I already see the constraint, they were working in opposition, but Dave's already taken that into account when he went back to target 2 and lowered that from 15% EWR to 10. So he's kind of baked that in the cake a little bit. And we're counting on those EWR programs to really get us there. And that's action oriented. We got teams wrapped around it. There's budget for it.
And we have one half of that equation that we have control over.
Right. Yeah, I
because
understand.
SEMCO is
Right.
not a city entity,
Right,
in
right.
terms of under the governmental jurisdiction. And then there's the new program, I would say, is the electrification type of approach where, there's not a mandate, that would be, at least there's not a mandate right now. The question is, how would you move in that direction? And I think incentivizing obviously is probably the first step, but again, whether or not there's a appetite for that. 5%, if you look at 5% of the energy use of natural gas in the community, is a pretty big lift from an electrification standpoint. That would be a lot of movement, to do that. You think about what do you use, and again, the industries are the primary users of some of that natural gas. So it's a big lift, I think, as far as at least that 5% never seems like a big number, but getting that kind of movement, I think, is a pretty big effort.
Especially in absolute number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to just, from Brian and I's perspective, and I'll speak for him now for a second, but we really appreciate Dave's help in this particular bucket because this was beyond our ability to grab numbers. So there was a lot of thought put into that, and I just want to say in front of everybody that Dave lifted a big piece there for us, so we appreciate that.
We studied all these components through our work. So
Yeah.
it's just the commentary was so helpful to put it together, rather than just staring at the percentages.
Other comments on the targets or the thought process and how they got there? Okay. And do we want to skip the strategies and possible actions for now, or
I did have one more thought.
Yeah,
Just
boy.
reading my notes. It was just on target 4 from our prior conversation about should key lever number one, have reliability targets. You look at something like number 4.
sorry, target for or
Target
strategy
4,
for?
converting
Okay.
natural gas energy, and converting them over to electricity. When you think back to our key lever in the electric portfolio and being hand in hand with goals around reliability to avoid natural disasters, such reliance on electricity, if you don't have a good reliable portfolio, where the natural gas typically keeps flowing, right? In certain scenarios of shutdown. So there are other targets and other buckets like that one that points back to the electric portfolio and saying, yeah, maybe we should have a target around reliability.
Yeah.
Because they're working hand in hand there.
Yeah. We're totally open to, Trav and I talked about that. Like, do we put something in here around affordability and reliability? And we were just like, it feels, for our purposes in this draft, we're like,
Yeah.
if it felt like a tough thing for us to feel, I mean, we want to walk into a room and flip the switch and have the light go on. Like that was, that would be good.
Yeah.
But having a target around that, and we can add them in, is all I'm saying. We just don't. We
We're
didn't
gonna
put it
need
in there
help.
right now. Yeah, we're gonna need some help.
We're gonna need help.
Yeah, mostly me.
If I can add a comment on targets in this particular one, what may be something the SDT might want to consider, and that's again a question for the SDT, and maybe it's more of an overarching target, if we're going back to the high level beyond or above all of the different levers. But if not, I could see it maybe under this lever would be that the community plan speaks to being a community that creates a plan that's attractive to business. So is there a target in terms of business attraction or retention, that you would want to have in here or not? I mean, and is this the right place for it if there would be one?
Yeah, and that could that indirectly could represent affordability then, right? So if it is attractive and it's drawing people, then it's probably affordable. 'Cause-
And reliable.
And reliable, because they wouldn't come if those things didn't exist.
Back to Boyd's comment.
Yeah.
The targets that he mentioned would probably show up what you're speaking to.
Agreed.
So last, maybe clarification for me. So we have 5 targets. Is there a priority? Or are these all equal weight, or should we establish a priority on multiple target things?
They are not prioritized, that's all I will say.
Okay,
So-
should we think about, so again, for some of these maybe competing things, is this a place to try to establish like what would be our priority for these things? What, are the things that, we think that these things probably should happen, but if it happens a different way, like this has to be our number 1 target underneath this goal. This has to be number 2, and these ones we think are reasonable targets given, kind of the current setting. But hey, if those change and we still meet target 1, that's success.
Is it largest impact to smallest impact? A simple way. We don't have the quantification here, but I know that you have the math behind them.
I don't know. I'm just thinking like one of them that kind of jumps out for me, like target 5. Like if we get to 2030 and we don't have good data yet, I feel like that's a problem. So I would put that relatively high. Like it's one of the things that we have some control over, and if it's data that we've kind of talked the whole time, like you can't make any of these decisions without quality data, and that's I think that's should be relatively high on the list of things that we should be trying to accomplish for sure. So is it number 5? Like, I don't know. I think it'd be, but so I know some of these have 1 and some of them have more. should we be establishing or thinking about some sort of priority?
And personally, I can go either way with it. I totally agree with what you're saying, Jeff, so it would be easy to go the way. I've struggled with, and I've heard this, and PJ, if he was here, he'd be asking the question at some point today, but is, we're not implementing this, we're just making recommendations, as I understand it, to city council, and then there's a group that has to implement this, and this is purely a question, I don't have the answer to it, but is it that group responsible to prioritize and put it into play, or is it us that's responsible? So that'd be my question to go with your question, Jeff.
Or is it like A level and B level? Like we think these are the top two things
Sure.
and we think these are kind of another tier? I don't know if that would be helpful for kind of defining where we see the different targets.
Certainly would validate our recommendation, right? I mean, if you had a way to
Yeah,
give it some scale.
yeah.
We could give guidelines where they could be more
I don't know if
specific in
that
their
would be,
strategy.
again, I guess I think I want to make this thing helpful. Like,
Yeah.
would
I-
that
I would
add
pref-
to the helpfulness of this recommendation or this document?
As it relates to this section, Jeff, I would agree with you that the target 5 as written right now is the most controllable relative to, like, you just got to decide to go and collect the data and
You
put
gotta
it in a spreadsheet every year.
Somebody's got to go after it. It's not an easy lift, but
Right.
I think probably long term, we have to put something together to get data like that.
Yeah, I think that to me is very important, and however we bold or highlight it or italicize it, I don't really care. And then we can list the other, and moving forward, we could categorize them in 2 different buckets, like must versus, should think about, or we can just call them all targets and not put numbers.
Well, and you could also, it just adds another layer of work to it, but you could also put keynotes in each section and say, like, then you could just verbalize in your notes, like, we feel that target 5 must be, done immediately, and those could be notes that you put out to them.
It feels like you're almost saying it's a dependency. That doesn't belong to the target. It's these things are dependent upon implementing this type of a measurement system. It's an action that's needed to even get there. So is it really a target?
And it's a
Yeah.
specific action where a lot of these words, as they should be, are very general.
Yeah.
Achieve, okay, great,
Yeah.
I will do that.
And it's measurable. you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this
I-
one says establish a
It seems like a
baseline.
Well,
dependency
it's
almost.
because it doesn't exist yet.
Right, that's why,
It's still an
Because it's
action,
not to be
a target's an action that needs
Because
to be
that's,
done.
Correct.
because that's not easy and nobody does it, right? Like, are you aware of any communities that have
Not
data
really
tracking systems
segmentation like that. No, probably not. But I think what we heard from this group
Probably because
along.
they don't want to share the.
Yeah, well, along the way, what we heard from this group is, do we have information in our business segment that really tells us who the big energy users are by kind of class of business and stuff? And we've done some preliminary work in that area to try to get at it, but we really don't have great information that we can draw upon to say, because they are this type of business, here's where the opportunities really exist. And I think what this target does, and maybe the suggestion I was going to add for this target is give it a date. Everything else has a date. So if you want it earlier, if you think it's a higher priority, then maybe suggest it to council that there be a date associated with getting that benchmark information in place.
Yeah, I think, I guess I want to, and like, I don't think that maybe, Brian, I don't think that this exists elsewhere. Like, data tracking like is being suggested by that target. I think it's important. If you say we want that by next year, like, nobody has that now. So, like, there's not really, that's a challenging target. I do think it's important.
yeah, to what level of granularity in how you slice the data, I think you're right. No other community has anything like it, and it would be very hard to do depending on how granular you wanted to get. But from our purposes at this committee, and let's say this committee meets again in 3 or 5 years, and nothing changes on the governance side, it would be very helpful. I think we all would have been pumped to see, like, you know, local GDP and local employees at the top 20 employers in energy users in town in 2010 overlaid with the energy data, and then 2018, and then like those are some massive I mean 70% of our pie is commercial and industrial buildings. So how those businesses are doing is literally a massive mover on our carbon emissions. And so just, I mean, and there's lots of other building categories where you could get into other kind of like these sorts of conversations, but I think from a very high level, those are the kind of like, you know, community metrics that don't exist that would be really empowering with all the assumptions listed of like what we do and don't know. But to be able to say like, oh, in the last 5 years, you know, our industrial customers' energy usage has gone up 7%, but their, you know, widgets produced or sales dollars went up 25%. So we're more efficiently making those parts as it relates to electricity and carbon than we were in the past, right? Like we just don't have that as a community. And having a group go and ask those questions and figure that out and then have that reported on consistently is just a, you know, is just a missing piece. And so whether that's the goal or a target or a special note or bolded or whatever, like I don't really care, but we really need it for next time, because we don't have it this time, and it's useful.
Yeah, I mean, some of that data exists, right? Like Hope College knows carbon intensity per square foot of building on campus and per student and like per employee. Like a lot of the businesses will have some of that. Some of the businesses will have that data.
Maybe some.
Maybe some.
And they may or may not share it.
Correct.
Is one other thing, right? So but to have the challenge of the target and maybe a year is the way to do it. I will, and I don't want this to come off wrong, but I will remind everybody of a tension too, and it was a tension that Joe shared with everybody, which is I would encourage us to pick and choose the granularity that you get into about what you're reporting back on and what you're collecting information on carefully. Yeah. Because the feedback, remember, that we got is that at some point the staff, which we're limited on, right, will end up spending all their time collecting data and information instead of doing the work to actually drive the data and the information. And it's a tension, right? Like we all are very familiar with those types of things where you need good data to make good decisions, but sometimes you're, 10 years down where you're just collecting data and it really hasn't done anything to drive outcomes.
Well, and I think
so it's just a good tension to remind, like there's some places where you want to dive deep into it and there's some places where you're like, yeah, that's probably not quite as important.
That's why this is a good discussion. We haven't had this discussion because
I'm not drowning out the discussion, but I'm just reminding there is a tension here.
Well, and if we do our job well in the report writing, then we're going to be empowering council to understand that there's going to be, like, in order to do X, Y, or Z, you're going to have to support the staff such that they can do it by way of budgets and resources, right? Like this is not to me, this is not an exercise in do more with the same amount. If we're increasing goals and whatnot for whatever reasons, then we have to empower council to understand that, whatever staffing ramifications that coincide with that, they have to have that too, right? Because I know lots of people that we do business with, and I've dealt with Ann over the years and Barry and all kinds of people at the BPW, and what this community is doing related to energy compared to any other is crazy town more impressive. And just to dump a whole bunch more work on them and not empower council to know that they're already doing way more than most and that this needs to be resourced appropriately is unfair to everybody. So I just think that's part of our job is like, hey, with these increased whatever, be prepared to support that work.
And I feel like I'm the guy that keeps kind of saying, but remember, as the guy that has the budgets, we have a deficit. In effect, we have a deficit budget for FY22. So it's not like we've got money sitting in corners you know, to do more either.
And
So,
that's the ongoing
and that's not your
I was gonna say,
your guys'
that sounds like
problem.
not my problem.
It's not my problem.
But guess whose
As
problem
the-
it very
as the-
quickly
what is
becomes,
this-
right?
what is
So
this
it's just
title?
reality.
Community representative, there it is.
But it's
Yeah.
but I wouldn't be doing my job if I reminded you of. I mean, we're talking about constraints, right? There are
Sure,
there's real
yeah, but we're
constraints.
gonna, but we'll let those constraints play out with the people that have to deal with them, which is, you know, council and city manager. So, I mean, we can't pre-bake that into what we're doing.
Brian, just to prove to Keith that I was listening, and I appreciate that input, that fifth target, if we're really trying to drive an understanding of the industrial segment then, could that target be more specific to talk about baseline energy intensity of a particular segment instead of each customer class?
That could be a better way to
Just
go
a
about
way
it.
to-
Because I think residential is pretty easy, right? You got number of homes and you have that all metered. You can do a high level swag.
Yeah, I mean, if you want correlating with square foot or anything like that, I mean, they could do that. But we've got a number of customers, obviously, of energy usage because we do the, it might be harder to get it to square foot if we were doing Semco data because, you know, we get in mass the number from the city of Holland. We don't get granular energy usage from Semco down to the individual home because of privacy implications and things
Sure.
like that. So,
It's
yeah.
still resource time though, Dave, right? Like the more broad we try to take
The
it
more
on,
broad, the easier it is.
more data, more.
Yep, but the more, the more granular we get in terms of trying to segment, then obviously to Keith's
Could
point,
it be a
that
baby
takes more.
step?
Yeah.
Or at least a step one.
I
for
think
the
that's
cycle.
I think that's the objective here is that we're starting to think this way and put some of this stuff in place. And again, we can have 1,000 assumptions underneath what all these metrics are, but we can let the SDT in 2035 think about like natural gas per,
Right.
oven plugged in per square foot, whatever. Like that's, right now we just got to start where we are, which
Would it be
is,
industrial that we would have loved to have gotten our hands on this cycle?
it's just such a big mover relative to our
Yeah.
pie and, so, but
I guess just one comment around that. I think, right, we're coming up, I know I'm signed up for one of these, like the little listening tours coming up. I mean, maybe this is something where we try to get feedback, like, because if we had data on just the top 10 customers, that would have been glorious. So like, we're talking to some of these customers, so is this something where we can try to, like, get some sort of feedback from them on whether this is something
Yeah,
that
I don't
they
know if
would
we want to dive
participate
into the
in?
details then, but we
Not the
might want to
details,
ask
but
them
like at
whether
a
or
high-
not they're willing
At a high level.
to start sharing some things so we can create correlations of data between industrial use and energy, just to see if they're open to that sort of thing. That's certainly something I think we could explore in that conversation.
It's part of our
Yeah,
outreach.
I mean, I think to Keith's point, like, I think we want the data, but not all of the data, because that's too much data and too much time. So I think we need to only stay at the high level,
Yeah.
otherwise you bog down in it.
And the system, I think the system has worked and the system will work moving forward. And what I mean by the system is the SDT, like saying, hey, these are your goals and your targets and kind of your strategies. And then allow the steering committee to, like, things are always changing. We've acknowledged, and allow them to dig into and kind of come up with the solutions too. But this is exactly what we need, right? The push and prod and identify, like, okay, what are your priorities? So kind of maybe a weighting does potentially make sense, Jeff.
I don't know, I guess to me, it would make sense to do like tier A and tier B
Yeah.
for the targets and so for this one, I would put target 1 and target 5 in tier A, and 2, 3, and 4 would be tier B. But that would just be kind of like the buckets that I would put those in. And I think, I don't know if it makes sense to keep these all as targets or just do that. Like, if you meet target 1 and target 2, or target 1 and target 5, and 2, 3, and 4 are a little bit different, you don't quite meet those, okay?
That's what the target is. You're shooting at it. You're
Yeah.
trying to hit it, right?
They were
But
considered.
if like, you make target 2 and target 5, but you don't get target 1, like, which is a better scenario? So that's why I think having some sort of a hierarchy would be helpful, but
If there's a narrative that explains and passes down knowledge on why we've done this, I think that's really helpful. It just, it captures a moment, it captures a thought process and helps guide those who assume it.
Because
after
ultimately, there's variables in all of this too,
Yeah.
so.
Operationalize.
Jeff, I totally support that we can put them in a different order, a better order. We could talk about why they're in a certain order, and if we want to call them A and B or whatever. I think that that's great. I mean, I'm passionate about 5 being, I'm in your camp. 1 and 5 to me are the big ones, and 5 is the most controllable one. You know, so and it's the one that would be, I think, the beginning of the most helpful one to always have in the mix of these committees moving forward is like, what was our intensity? How did we calculate that? Do we need to adjust how we calculate the intensity? You know, I'm thinking in 5 and 10 years from now, like, oh, we're not thinking about intensity the right way. We need to ask a different question of the industrials or whatever, right? We just got to start on that path. So,
And I totally agree, and I think we should move on, but one thing that we just have to be really careful about, if we truly want to move the needle on things, gathering data is good, but we also have to implement. And if we fail to implement but have a boatload of data, we did nothing, except for gather a bunch of data. And I'm not speaking in absolutes. I know it maybe sounds like that, but I just want us to be cautionary on that move. So,
agreed.
next one.
Cool. All right, that's good. We'll circle up on strategies and possible actions down the road. Key lever, transportation, the goal being to encourage the establishment of the Greater Holland Community Green Mobility Strategic Plan. I think Travis came up with that, I'm not sure. And we didn't, we were, yeah. What do we think of the goal there? I think this is our way of being like, wow, transportation is really broad, and this, of all the things that we have partial impact on, that feels like the most partial relative to all the other stakeholders that need to be at the table. So that's why we wrote that the way that we did. Any recommendations or reflections on that?
The word encourage caught me right away. That is that a goal to encourage, or is it a desire? I mean, is it not quite? That's the only thing that struck me about it.
You could just go to establish the Greater Holland
Yeah,
Community
be
Green
more-
Mobility Strategic Plan.
Do it.
And we talked about this because I remember, I'm recalling the conversation now, is we had like something more concrete, like establish, but then we went back to like, is that the BPW's, you know, fundamentally the role, or the city, is it the city's role? We didn't know, right? Like, as it relates to jurisdiction and all the people touching streets and how transportation flows through this community, like, is it the city or the BPW's job to be the ones to establish this thing, or is it someone else's job? So that's why we put encourage, but we can be more specific. We just didn't know whose job that was.
And that strategy number 1 is really where we were getting at with that too, if you look at strategy.
Yep.
Very open to any changes to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot here. You could be very concrete, like strategy. Of course, now we're going to a strategy. Fast charging installations. That's pretty concrete. You know, you do it or you don't do it, or you plan for it. And the others are develop a partnership, which we do and we should do and we should continue to do. The city does have bike lane plans, and we're installing a bike lane now. So it ties in with some of that, although this, you know, the city doesn't say encourage establishment of a green mobility strategic plan. But do we want to say something to, let's encourage, you know, we're such a car-centric society. Do we want to encourage other ways of transportation? Is there a greater, you know, kind of goal going on here, or strategy. We have, electric vehicles, the BPW is involved with that, that's the clean energy there. Infrastructure, we can do bike lanes, everything. Should it be mentioned that a goal would be to think of alternative, tie some of it together with a singular goal, or one goal that says alternative measures of, or means of transportation.
I think that's what we were trying to get at, so to speak,
Okay.
with green mobility.
Stick with green mobility.
I don't know.
And-
It's all what
Yeah.
wordsmithing.
Okay.
What you're saying, Nikki, I think is what we wanted to get to, but, and we could have just botched the whole thing writing it too, but the developing in partnership with McIntyre Express, McIntyre Karting Council, Lakeshore Advantage, a community mobility plan, and keeping an understanding as somebody who's had a lot to do with the Greenway development, it crosses jurisdictional lines like crazy.
Correct.
It is not, a mobility plan just in the city of Holland would be less than great if it was connected so you could cross to your workplaces and other parts of the
Needs to be more
community.
regional.
So it needs to be more regional, which is why we were pushing for the strategic plan and other groups to be pulled in to put it together. And if that did get put together and a group had adopted it and it was being implemented across the region, I guess that's what we were trying to get at there. Maybe not worded real well, but that's the point. There's other things like, the city being able to decide how many chargers they can put on 8th Street or wherever they're gonna put them. Like, those are pretty clear, concrete things that could be done. And it could just be part of a plan where it's like, hey, we wanna have 50 charging stations by the 2030 or by 2025 or whatever your number is. That's stuff that could be done probably pretty easily, and most likely even without the city even having to do a lot of work with it. BPW may have to provide infrastructure to it, but there's other entities that are going to come in and want to put in fast charging systems and, so Electrify America and groups like that. So I think it's really just trying to figure out what's the plan, and I think that plan has to be bigger than just the city in this respect. That's my opinion.
What if, I was just looking back at the building energy consumption, how simple it was to reduce carbon emissions in the built environment. What if it was reduce carbon emissions in the greater Holland community, transportation network or something like that? Your first strategy is already talking about building up the plan. That's not really the goal, right? That was one of the strategies to get to something else. So we could keep it real simple like the other key levers and really say what we're trying to do. This is all about reducing emissions from transportation. And then you have ready infrastructure and collaboration plans and everything else as strategies.
I'm great with that. I mean, as it relates to the goal, I'm fine with something broad with the word transportation in it.
Yep.
And then the targets are there. And then the strategy, possible action, right? The first one sort of gets at what we were trying to get at with the goal. I'm fine with that. How does that strike other people?
I don't know if you want to, like, in the goal, if it's just reduce carbon intensity, but then like improve livability of the community,
That's
or
good,
add
too.
something like that to the, kind of at that high level, to get at more, like, right, you want to,
Mobility.
that word. Yeah, increase not just the carbon intensity, but like decrease traffic and increase walkability and increase bikeability and kind of just the
It's interesting.
usability of the transportation system.
Snow melt on 21st Street. Sorry, did I hear something?
The reason I'm smiling is because council members, I'm not asking them to ask that, but when we had a very popular project about this last year where, quite frankly, the feedback from me from council was staff pushed too hard on livability, on transportation, some of those types of things, and what got approved was not what was recommended. So it gets complicated.
Doesn't mean that this won't come.
Sounds like that's in the not my problem bucket, Keith.
Not your problem, not my, but I mean, it's like,
Was
words
that
matter.
sign
Yeah.
say? Was that sign say again, Brian?
Gotta keep reading this.
Yeah.
A different community representative in your chair might have a different opinion.
I'm sure. Good thing that's not me.
You'll never win.
Yeah, I like making the goal more broad, and what about these targets? What do we think?
It's hard, you mean the strategies, you mean?
No, the targets
The
underneath transportation. So
Oh, I
readiness
see,
to
I see.
serve
You got
from
it.
an infrastructure perspective.
I don't know what that means.
I think we were trying to get at, hey, there's going to be like a lot more electric things, vehicles. So charging station infrastructure. I think that's what we're just big. Hey, be ready for it, right? Like if this is coming, which we want it to, and we think it is, part of the reliability, affordability, the reliability is that they're ready to actually like serve the load in the places that needs it.
How do I measure it? How do I know if we're successful?
I don't know.
That's what I'm
Pay
struggling.
attention to complaints to Keith. I'm
Right.
not sure.
I don't know if we're talking bus stops, charger. I mean, what are we? We talking bike path miles? I'm just struggling a little bit there. How do we know success there?
You can measure success when it's something that BPW and the city actually has control over.
Well, I think,
I mean, there's some things in
Yeah.
infrastructure that, but Brian Travis said it well. I mean, there's a whole bunch there that,
Yeah.
I think there's two things here. One, yes, measurable is a very important aspect, and everything else that we've seen so far on targets has been pretty easily measurable. Remember what happens when we calculate this piece of the pie for the community. It's a factor of the carbon for each of the fuel sources,
Yeah.
and it's the vehicle miles traveled
Right.
for each of those fuel sources. So, I mean, if you're talking about changing the way people are mobile, you can affect the vehicle miles traveled. Now, it's not gonna be, again, controllable in 100% city or BPW. It's a regional discussion, and then there's an adoption issue on the part of the consumer out there. But ultimately, you're trying to affect two things: the intensity of their transportation mode from a carbon perspective, and the amount of vehicles that they travel. So, I mean, are those targets, are they ripe for being targets in this lever?
Right.
So is that a nice way of saying we should delete target 1?
I'm just throwing out my.
No, I mean, I need the translation.
No, I mean, I think it's hard to. I think Boyd's right. I was ready to ask the same question before he did. Is how do I measure that? You can do that through qualitative surveys, responses. Like people feel like Holland is EV ready or is whatever. I mean, there's a certain thing you can get on a perception basis, but it's harder to measure than I would say other targets that are much more related to the outcome, which is less miles traveled in vehicles and a less carbon intensity for each of those miles.
So here's another messy part, that with transportation, and it goes back to the electric part too. So all of this is top-down stuff. We're doing it, the city's doing it, the HPPW is doing it. And will have to get people involved, and how do you, because ultimately, you can lead a horse to water, and with some of the, like the homes, the building codes and the installation of insulation and whatnot, is an equity issue too. How do we put in that this material gets to people? We're putting in chargers, we're doing this, we're doing that. How eventually it has to become everyone's. Everyone has to own it.
Well, absolutely. I think if you look at the verbiage at the end of the document here where it talks about not just control, but leadership needs to be
Yeah.
everywhere in the community on these issues. It's exactly right. And I mean, even things that we've discussed so far on the building consumption, there's incentives that are provided, but there's an adoption issue there as far as whether people do it, take advantage of it, decide it's not enough, whatever. I mean, that's there is a need for this to become a priority of everybody in the community, not just things that the BPW and city do to try. I think we've used the words on-ramp or enabling mechanisms in the past, things that help create opportunities. PACE district, which we didn't really get into the strategies, but we know that out of county did move forward with the PACE district, so good news, you're already done with one of your items. But, you know, that's an enabling mechanism, but it doesn't mean that we mandate everybody to utilize it. So, spot on, Nikki, this is great stuff, and it's providing leadership. You'll see some things in here, I think strategies, appreciate the group, you know, Travis and Brian coming up with things. There's things where the city and the BPW are demonstrating leadership in the building consumption, for example, going back to that, reducing our own carbon by 80%, you know, I mean, you see that as a strategy in there, in the transportation, committing to certain fleet electrification within ours, but that's leadership. That isn't necessarily everywhere in the community, though. It takes everybody in the community to step up to the plate on these things.
Looking at strategy too, to that point, I mean, even though, so looking at electrification of vehicles and charging stations concepts, I mean, there could be a number of charging stations per registered EV vehicle. If we're talking infrastructure.
Yeah, you can get more specific.
Something, because we know we can get registered vehicles, we can get a count on the stations probably. We need to see a ratio there, and does that lead to action, right? But that in itself, I don't know that we have a metric for how many, maybe there is some standard out there. But
Yeah, if you.
the collection of that.
Last time the SDT met in 2018, they compared themselves to the state. So we did BEVs, we wanted 2 times the state average. Well, it turned out we were already kind of kicking butt on that. So, they modified that to 5 times the BEV number, and the
Okay.
state was the metric. So if you wanted to do chargers per capita or chargers per square mile or whatever and compare it to the state's average
Yeah.
somehow, I mean, you could do something like that to say that we're a leader. I mean, that's a way
Yeah,
of
yeah,
taking that metric and making it in a leading sense. Those are things that you
Sure.
might be able to do.
Chargers per registered EV is interesting to me because unknowingly there could be barriers to people buying EVs because of a perception of not having chargers in the public space, you know, in the environment.
Or the reality of where they drive.
Right.
Doesn't have charging station.
Right.
If I drive to Lansing every day because I'm a legislature and I don't have that infrastructure there,
Right.
I'm not buying an EV
Good
car.
point. We have commuters coming in.
You know, I mean, there's all the things we have to think about,
Excellent
right?
point, yeah.
I mean, there are people that come here to visit this community because it's a tourism town. Do you think they're gonna buy an EV car just to come here because they're gonna be here for 3 days?
No.
They're not. So, I mean.
But factory
But,
employer-
so maybe we should reduce our tourism industry because we're not attracting gasoline cars to our area. So, I mean, we can take this to the in-depth level of saying, but these are lawfully goals. I think we have to really keep that in mind. We have to keep our reality in check too, where we're going with this.
Right.
And so we can analyze each and every aspect of these targets in depth. But as somebody has already alluded to, I believe it was you, Travis, is we're not going to get started down this path that we need to get started down if we keep working too hard at the finite granular issues that are before us.
And I think I would just add to that, Scott, that one of the things I said it earlier and I'll say it again is, and I don't know the answer to this, but are we supposed to put more broad general recommendations out that a steering committee or whoever the city is then going to have to figure out how to do that? Or do we need to nail all that down for them so that they're just implementing what we wrote? That's a question that I don't know the answer to, but that would take this document in a different direction. Like we're getting into the granular on some of this, and it's totally fine. That's not me disagreeing with it. I'm asking, do we need to do that, or do we give the broader stroke so that then the implementers have to figure out how to implement?
The charter of the group sort of speaks to recommending goals and metrics, and then recommending strategies. I mean, had this kind of tongue-in-cheek with somebody else the other day about what the role of this group was, but as far as developing strategies, and you're called the strategic development team. So, I mean, it is sort of imply that at the strategy level, there's some recommendation on there. But then what that does is it transitions, first of all, to city council to adopt your recommendations. Then once those are adopted or modified as they see fit, then there's a steering committee and a group to take and do the implementation of those strategies to actually do. I think you've listed those, and I appreciate that we've listed those as possible action steps, but they are possible. I mean, doesn't mean that you or the city council are gonna spell out how to get it done. You want outcomes, and you want strategies pursued, and it's up to somebody else to take that and figure out how to actually implement that.
I would suggest also one other thing. I think in some areas, maybe where there's already been more action, that if we're on a journey, maybe we've been a long ways on the journey, where a more definitive SMART goal makes sense. And I think it's okay that in some other areas, you're just starting your journey, and to not have as strong of a SMART goal that aligns with a goal in another area is perfectly fine also. Because this whole structure is set up to be iterative. So knowing that we both have responsibilities on the steering committee side of this, after you guys make a recommendation to council, like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't beat yourself too much about some of the granularity in some of the items. Trust the process a little bit too.
So this could be really simplified to one target that reads very similar to the electric portfolio. We could pick transportation calculations that we benchmarked from the past. We could pick a reduction by a certain year, recognizing that things like EV technology is autonomous is coming along, things like that. So it could get pushed way up, since the goal now is reduce carbon emissions from transportation and.
Yeah, I'd say again, vehicle miles traveled and the carbon intensity of the transportation mode could be targets. Then if you only came up with those, then I would probably suggest the same thing that I did under the building energy or the building consumption environment, and that is, remember that one of the goals of CEP is to be attractive to business. So is there an economic development or a business question from a target perspective under transportation that you would want to add as well, and I don't know the answer to that, and maybe you can't answer that, and maybe city council can't, but I think the whole idea behind this being a regional discussion is because there's an economic element that's in play here too, beyond a climate, related element, so.
That's, I think this transportation's easier than the others, it seems. It's concrete, it's easily, there are some steps you could actually do, and it's already been started. You've got a program for electric vehicles, there's a website, and then to install more, you cover your tourism, you're driving to Lansing. I mean, to me, this is not as nebulous or amorphous as some of the other levers that we've discussed.
And there's other people working it. So if you've just listened to the news at all lately, you hear GM and Ford and everybody saying 40% of their vehicle market by 2030 or by 2025 or whatever their number is. I think it's like 2025 or something. They're like saying they're going to produce 50% or whatever's coming off the line is going to be electric. Those kind of things are going to drive these goals more than you probably are even at the city level.
Right.
So how much energy and time you put into something like this is, that's why we went with the strategic plan piece, because you really need to have a plan and be prepared for how you're going to accept that and manage that, more than you need to worry about how many chargers you probably install on 8th Street.
Yeah.
That's just my personal opinion. I think other people are going to start in charge, gas stations are going to start putting chargers at the gas stations, and organizations like mine just installed 4 more chargers because there's so many people coming in and parking in our lot and wanting them, and it's already happening. So for us to say like, oh, that's the best place to put a bunch of our energy where everything's already moving, like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But creating a plan that helps encompass the whole point of view seems to be more of the point of that goal that Brian and I drafted. So for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, Dave, what did you say? Vehicle miles traveled and carbon intensity of
the mile that's
fuel.
involved, of the fuel essentially. So I mean, EV adoption is one aspect, but there's also encouraging alternative fuel. I mean, if you look at the BPW and cities policy, we have a alternative fuel policy. And so, even if you have a switch to natural gas or propane or some other source in a transition, because that works well for the for the fleet, it's still an improvement. So I mean, it really comes down to two things that drive the calculation, which are the vehicles mile traveled and the carbon intensity of each of those miles. So I mean, you could do it that way. You could do it as you have it here, which is the percent EV adoption. You could do it like was suggested in terms of infrastructure by saying a certain amount of chargers per capita or per square mile, and compare it to the state average. There's a few things that you could do if you want to create targets. Ultimately, the calculation, though, back to Jeff's point on tier A versus B, you ultimately want the carbon reduced, right? I mean, that's your most important thing. Then the tier B, might be what are the things that feed into that. And doesn't matter which one does more or less as long as tier A is achieved. I mean, that's something you could do. EV adoption could be part of tier B as long as the carbon reduced under tier A is met, Those are some ideas if you want to stay consistent with the way you've done some of the discussion underneath some of the other levers.
Because you have them, in the final 13 metric ton calculation, there was some element prescribed to this bucket, so we could drive that right up into the target.
Yeah, yeah, we've got, yeah.
Just, and then we could talk about tier B, a few of the other thoughts.
Yeah. No, that sounds
Yeah,
good. We can definitely, yeah,
I guess
Jeff.
I would kind of second what Travis was saying, or at least what I understood you saying, is like a lot of this is stuff that you don't have granular control over. So let's pick the thing that we do have control over that will help, help the adoption, help, kind of the broader conversation, but pick the part to focus on that's the part that we have more granular control over. And then I think it would be reasonable to have some like high level carbon intensity of transportation or something like that. But I mean, maybe to Dave, your point on like, this is all part of like attractiveness to business and stuff. If we can get some language like that into like a broader community mobility plan. I mean, how many large cities, the number one complaint is traffic and getting around the city. So clearly that's one of the attractive things to Holland. I can drive to my work in 7 minutes, or I can bike and it's 12. Right. So those kind of mobility solutions are a big part of the attractiveness of a community. So I don't know if that can get in here somehow. But I think that is, I don't know. I don't have good definition around exactly what
If this
we
group
would
decides
want
that is something they want, again, a source of that, I would suggest would be, survey related, probably be more qualitative response from businesses, but again, that's up to you whether or not, how you want to put that in there as a target, whether you want that in there as a target, yeah.
Well, people who feel like they have some ideas on how they'd like some of this stuff to be written differently, or, and this goes with everything we've talked about so far, I'd love for you to put pen to paper and like send me like, hey, as I was thinking about like transportation target, like what if we wrote it like this? Like, just if you've had, in any of the 3 levers we talked about so far, if there's specific wordsmithing or editing that you'd like to see, like, I'd like you to write that stuff down and send it to me over the next couple of days, week, so that we can see some of this stuff up against each other and be like, oh, I like how that one's written, or let's switch that word out, like, because it's hard to remember all of this and envision what everyone is visualizing. And, Nikki, you were like, transportation is the least nebulous to me. And I was like, wow, it is the most nebulous to me.
That's what I felt too.
So I it couldn't be more ambiguous to me and so the fact that you were like, this is rock solid, we got this. I was like, wow, we all need to be writing things down and sharing
Also
notes.
makes me want to say, really, thank you. We are not criticizing or critical. This has been awesome what you two have done, and I said that before you did it, and I agree even more now. So yes, anything we can do to help, and that would be those are good suggestions, because that was heavy lifting.
Yeah, well, I
Learning
mean,
all these
We just
phrases
used a
now.
dartboard to pick numbers.
Yeah.
It wasn't really that hard, but
Beers.
I was like, Trav, how old were you when you had your first beer? And he was like, 25. And I was like, all right, 25% EV adoption. That's what we're going with. It was, we were just making it up. Months. Yeah. Oh, man. All right, so it's 5:09. We have in 2 weeks. I personally can stay 10 more minutes, but I'm not forcing that. We're after 3 levers. We have 2 left. So we can be done. Or we can go 10 more minutes and cover education.
Stay with 10 more minutes.
Anyone have to go?
Shall we vote? I feel like this needs votes,
All in
right?
favor?
All in favor?
So close.
No one's getting up. We'll do it.
Motion, and then we got I'll second.
Vote
the
by
motion.
standing or not standing.
You walk
Just
out,
leave if
you're
you want to
voting.
go.
The mayor always says, I see nodding heads.
So the key lever, the next one, education. So the goal is to establish community education awareness program or programs to promote CEP programs, performance, and goals. So that's the goal. And you see the targets there, educational KPIs and a methodology for tracking, review and establish 2030 goals for those KPIs with the next SDT, and develop a community education center. So speaking of like things that it's an iterative process and we haven't had, things we haven't had and we need to start, this is a lot of that. So what were people's reactions and reflections on this?
Can you give me a little bit more depth of target 3, develop a community education center? Can you give me a little bit more about
Yep.
that?
So one of the goals that we're working on already in this community is developing a place where sustainability related education as well as resources could be obtained, and making it readily available in the community, easily accessible by people. And that's something that we think is really important. And also, an education center, someplace where even you could do educational programs and things like that.
So we got the Discovery Center, which does some things, and we also have the BPW has a nice classroom style hallway. So are we gonna try and bring this all together? Or are we just gonna maybe identify these locations and enhance them?
I think we have an idea and a plan to look at how we bring multifaceted kind of alignment from a variety of areas. Because when we start talking, there's the CEP part of this, but then there's also all the other sustainability related factors in the community, from conservation related things, water quality, all this other stuff. And right now it's kind of scattered all over the community, and there's no central spot where somebody can come and get resources on that. And we want, this is like a goal that we even have at the ODC and within our whole ODC network group, but is to create something like that. So we see that as a real win-win for the community to develop a place that can be the go-to location, kind of the clearinghouse, can offer resources out to the public. The BPW has a beautiful facility, but unfortunately it's also behind a gate and in a building that's not easily accessible all the time. I think this is doing something a little different than that. It's not duplicating that exact resource. That's still a resource, still has something to offer, can be linked to this, but this would be something more broader yet than that. So.
Other comments or questions on the education goals or targets? You look ready, Jeff.
The one comment I had on this was, like, how big is the team and what are the resources that we're envisioning allocating towards education versus the other things? Because the targets are fairly, like, even just target 1, that's a big target. Not that we shouldn't have, I think education is a huge piece of this for wider community buy-in, but is there, I don't know, like what is the team size for this, and how do we get enough people that, because I think you said it earlier, Brian, we can't do this lever with just say, hey, do more, all of you people that are already overworked, do more stuff.
So I'm going to weigh in on a couple things here because I think it's helpful, and it and again informs kind of the iterative process of what we've been using. So we've thrown so much information at you guys, right, in these months and months. But like recall, and I think it's in our resource document, that Mark Vanderploeg and Ann have worked on a 5-year plan that they're at the end of finalizing, that would be instituted, I think, January 1 of 22. Thanks. I like it when I get facts right. So in a way, right, a lot of resources have already gone into place that in a way this almost just embraces work that's already been done and that would be implemented. Then you pair that with, like, in this last, really just over a year, the city's created a new partnership with the ODC that's not really community energy plan, but it's sustainability, and we all see the amount of overlap there. That you take a look at some changes that we were able to make at the city where we have a sustainability project manager full-time. Now he's got other responsibilities, right, that are here. So while in some of the other areas I've been kind of like, this is an area where I think a lot of work has already been put in and is starting to align around things. So I think I'm feeling pretty bullish on that. We can put some substance onto this and move it forward. And where it's hard, like KPIs, like coming up with percentages, and Brian and Travis pull out their dartboard again. I mean, that's going to be hard, right? But I think that's kind of the challenge then, that would be one of the things with the steering committee is let's find some baselines. Let's do some community surveys. Let's find out how many people are maybe coming through a resource hub or, all of those types of things. Because without the education, I think we all recognize the education is going to be the most important trigger to get people to change their behaviors. Yep. And ultimately this hinges on, this is all going to go or not based upon people changing their behaviors. And I think education is the most powerful tool that we have in that.
Yeah, so, I think to add on to what Keith just said too, if you look at these KPIs, even though the community education center would be an outcome and what it would be in terms of its creation, it still is a means to an end. It's a means to provide information to people. And we've always felt like, we do a pretty good job with that, but then we hear that nobody can find it on our website, or they can, whatever it might be, right? We hear this feedback all the time, or we ask people how many people were aware of a program that we had. So it's really about the outcomes. The KPIs are about whether or not the education is reaching the individual and they feel empowered by it. So, we don't have that data today. And so I think that's really important. Maybe this group can even weigh in on, what questions or what outcomes, would be appropriate targets to pursue in terms of the KPIs. That if we surveyed people, certain percentage of them felt like they knew exactly where to go for information about energy efficiency or whatever it might be. What kind of outcomes are important to be measured underneath education?
And so, again, you said there's things that aren't your problem, right? They're city council problems. This is going to become a big council problem in that when we talk about
Opportunity.
Or an opportunity, but an education center, right? This could be interpreted as a physical location, funding a physical location, its operations, its staffing. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. That's a big commitment. With a $250,000 budget shortfall this last year, we had to do some budget amendments for. We don't know what the future is going to look like. Hand in hand with our school systems, we're going to work hand in hand with the Outdoor Discovery Center and the Holland Energy Plan. We're going to invest in what we already have and do a little bit. That makes sense. I get that. We have a sustainability person that we've already hired, right, to support that role. So it just concerns me. I want to make sure that what we're intending here in Target 3 is the same thing as that somebody's going to interpret on the other side of the aisle here on what council's doing on this. Because this is a city plan, right? It's our plan. This isn't a regional. I don't see develop a regional community education center. You know, if regional partnerships mean that we do that, and we're looking at them to help support and fund it, that's a different story. So maybe it's just might be a little wordsmithing too, but
Yeah.
I mean, this is a city plan, but if we're talking about, like I said, introducing other partners to support this, because this isn't just about us, this is all the consumers and all the traveling that goes around in our townships in and out, so, as we've been speaking to.
This is a really bad analogy, and I don't know why this one grabs my attention, not that I'm gonna do it, but kind of the KPI and the outcome. It's like, I see a lot of commercials on TV for the Good Feet store, right? But it doesn't mean that I've gone there and bought their insoles yet. And in this area, this is one of those areas where I think both Dave and I have given you feedback where it's hard, right? Because I think we can always do better. But if I would hold up like our video crew, like I think we're top of class in pushing out a lot of information. But if it doesn't change the outcome, then what are we being, so it's
Well,
always going to be tough.
But I think your example is actually great, because what I'm hearing you say is we don't even know how many people have heard of whatever the company, Good Feed Store, right? Like, you're not even getting to, like, is the advertisement impacting your behavior, and why isn't it? You're saying, what I'm hearing you say is we don't even know how many people are even seeing the ad, right?
Not completely true on a lot of the stuff that our historic measures, our social media, and we have pretty good information on that. But what we're doing in our larger education plan is not as good. So it's both.
So it's important.
It's both and.
Yeah.
And it's important.
Yeah.
But then I think Scott's caution is well founded, right? Where it's like, okay, what are we being actually measured on and expected to deliver, when just because you put out the information, and if it doesn't change people's behavior, that's another
There's multiple
level of
ways
the
doing it.
complexity.
And I also had a knee-jerk, when I first read this section, I thought, okay, yeah, the backbone to almost everything here. And then my first reaction was, shouldn't these components be embedded in the other areas? Does it need to be its own separate thing? And then until I got to target 3, and I went, oh, that makes, to Scott's point, that makes it a separate thing. Now are we talking physical? But the rest of it feels like, could it be embedded in the other levers?
I think it needs to stand out because it is the fuel that makes the whole thing go, and we haven't been tracking the high level performance of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Just for
I think in a
accountability.
future state, it's not its own lever. You
Okay.
have educational components in all of the other levers, and
I
you
see.
have
That's fair.
existing actual data and metrics that you're moving goals off of, because we have the data to know 42% of everyone in town knows about the energy waste reduction program.
Right.
And now we need to and 12% adopted it. How do we get the 42 up? How do we get the 12 up? That's the
Yeah.
kind of stuff that we don't have yet. And so that's why I think this time it lives on its own, but next time it's I think it can be embedded.
So then does target 3, if you take out target 3, it doesn't, I don't know. I don't know where to go with that
This is what I
statement.
think is
Target
more
3 really changes the whole thing, it feels like.
And there's already, I'll just be honest with you, there's already a group of people working on number 3.
Oh, good,
So
nailed it.
it's gonna happen, it's just to the scope and scale,
That's
but
good
it's already
information.
working. And it's people that help draft stuff. It's Joe, who works for us, who's
I see.
does our contract work with the city. It's Dan, who works for the city. It's
Okay.
Kelly Goward at the MAC. There's all kinds of work already underway with this
Okay.
one, which is why we put it in there, because we
helpful.
feel like that is the conduit forward to take all this stuff out. And without something like that, I just worry about how you do implement it. How does Ann, with her wonderful program that she puts together, how do you get that out into the masses, to the community, you have to have some forum to do that, in my opinion, and that's what this helps establish. It's not the only thing, but it's like the building block, it's the ground level to start to do that. So
My only ask to you, Travis, would be is with that going on, there was a reason it's going on, and that reason was probably some kind of outcome that you were looking for. Is there a way of sharing that outcome into these targets somehow? Like, what ultimately are you hoping that the
Right.
community education center does in terms of outcomes? Because so many other things in the plan so far have been, you know, this achievement or this reduction or whatever. And in education, is there, and I know we talk about coming up with KPIs, but are there things, even if we don't know the quantification of what that KPI would say today, are there categories of outcomes that should go into the targets?
yeah, maybe. I think, Ed, good point. I'll think on that too and figure out what maybe we could do different. I guess I would give you this analogy or this representation to go with this. When we started Project Clarity, we called education out as a separate major bucket of Project Clarity, one of the 4 major goals. And when we did that, we targeted largely the agricultural community because we knew through Project Clarity and all the metrics that 75% of the problem was coming from the agricultural areas. And when we started in on Project Clarity, there was very little being done, and there was little adoption by the agricultural community. There was little even discussion with the agricultural community. And within a couple years, creating some very calculated things like an agricultural subcommittee and providing some resources to that group and giving them some tasks that they were to take on and giving them some representation. And then we created like farmer education breakfasts and farmer luncheons and started to run educational programs for them. We stand today with like 180 farmers have adopted practices on like 70,000 acres of farmland, and there was like nothing before that. But it wasn't until we created all these little programs and these little outlets for those folks to get engaged did we start to see those things happen. Today, you could create very specific things to connect, you know, KPIs and so forth around agriculture. But when we first started, we just had to engage them. So until you engage them and give them a meaningful way to step in and become part of something, you have a really difficult time making that transition to like action happenings in the education world. If you don't have an outdoor discovery center with a place for people to come and someone greets them and meets them and does something with them, it's very difficult. So I think on an education front, that's just there. It's different. It's a different, like you can go do surveys all day long, but that doesn't necessarily educate anybody.
So Travis, the community education center will have a larger mandate,
Yes.
right? So
sure.
there's elements of this that we want to drive into the community. Okay, because this read, like we're making community education center to make our plan go. I think if we just,
Yeah, it needs to be worded differently.
yeah,
I totally
I get
agree.
it now.
I
Didn't know.
agree.
Maybe we can get the energy retrofit program included in this, because that sounds like.
Well, that's
what
and that
people
was part of the whole
know.
discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, I even know that Dan from the city and talking with him, it was, you know, like this could be a place where people could pick up, you know, stuff that the BPW has been giving away, like, you know, LED bulbs and things like that. You could also go there to get it. I mean, it's just, I don't know, there's just ways that we could do things with this, and it has not been, the cake has not been baked, trust me. But we have a lot to think through on that one, but we just feel like strongly that is one piece that's missing from what we're doing in the community, so.
Sounds like you got all the right people at the table to have a green mobility strategic plan built off of, hosted at the community education center,
Yeah,
the
I-
regional community
I-
education center.
I certainly don't want to be misinterpreted that I'm not supportive of the educational piece of this. I just want to understand that where we're going with it and how we're going about
No,
achieving that. I think it is the most important part. I really, to be honest with you, anything you need to learn about, that is the most important part.
And this
Meeting
is
adjourned.
really
Thanks,
good.
everybody.
Yeah.
All right.
And this is really great conversation. I hope you're finding, but it is that hard thing, right? Because in some ways it's like, boy, we're coming up with the ideas and we want to have the metrics there and the outcomes. And in other places it like organically happens a little bit different.
Yeah.
So I would just encourage you, like, we want to make this as good of a document and kind of mousetrap as possible. But yet at some point, you probably just have to lower the expectations of, and we'll get it even better next time y'all come back and serve on this volunteer committee that you get. We'll pay you double next time when you serve. How about that?
We didn't cover it.
But we
We're
will
out of
next
time.
Yep.
Right, probably right.
Yeah.
But everybody's probably seen it, so they'll be able to comment on that next time.
Yeah, for sure. We'll do carbon offsets and
Recommendations, considerations.
recommendations at the end. There's a lot. Yeah. And I seriously do want, from the stuff that we did cover, like, you want a word changed, put this stuff down. And now that we've had this conversation, this is the downside of the public meeting thing, I feel like, is we could have done some of this stuff via email ahead of time. But now that we've had this conversation, if you have notes or things that you've, wanted to lift up or wordsmith or what have you, Keith, they're allowed to circulate that now or send it to me. Okay, please send it to me. I love a full inbox. I'm just so pumped about my inbox being full.
Should we send each individual target as a separate email?
Each one,
With a subject
please.
line.
If you
Please,
could
Jeff.
only send it to me a sentence at a time, that'd be great.
Can you color code them with tier A and B targets?
So,
Yeah, this is-
dear Brian, this is goal 1, target 2,
Tier A.
tier A.
That's right.
And everybody else should feel free to suggest your own better system and send it that way.
That's
too.
right, yeah.
He'll filter that out.
Yep, that'd be really good.
When you look at that carbon offset thing, though, I will just end with that comment, is that we don't even know who's buying carbon offsets in the
Right.
community. And so we've put a number like 13.4 out, but it could be 8. Or, I don't know. We don't know. That was the main point of that last goal, is like, we need to figure that out, because how do you do a calculation absent of that kind of information?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we didn't even get to the fun part, which was the plan we presented is actually meeting the previous 2050 numbers.
20 years earlier.
Yeah, 20 years early. That'll be next time, June
So-
28th. That's right.
Couple
Cliffhanger.
logistic things as everybody's heading out, real quick here, Mr. Chair, if you can. June 28th, 3 to 5, just to let this group know that the BPW is meeting here in a special meeting on June 28th at 5 o'clock. So there will be kind of a timing constraint with that meeting, so it'll be 2 hours. We'll have to.
Okay.
And then we can always carry that conversation into July. I think the other thing is I've started to connect with certain of you. We continue to try to line up various community business stakeholders so that we can do that listening tour, and that's beginning this week. So we've got a couple this week, a couple next week, and then our key accounts person is continuing to try to make those logistic arrangements. So we'll keep reaching out to you to try to fill a single slot that we have for SDT on that, and we'll be able to kind of bring that into the conversation. Again, probably soon too, we'll want to start having some discussion about the community feedback mechanisms a little bit more. We know that you've given us kind of a 3-prong approach. One is some sort of surveys. One is this listening tour that we're doing. Another one has to do with inviting people in, specific groups into this conversation, at a meeting in the future. And maybe there's a 4th element, and that is the possibility of a town hall type of arrangement. So we'll keep working on some logistics with that.
Yeah, next time we'll get through carbon, we'll go through the notes that we talked through and be timely because of the 5 p.m., but talk about July as well. So we're moving to the hall. There you go.
Parking lot.
All right, meeting adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
I might be in Florida for the next one.